1 Corinthians 11, where it is maybe one of the most controversial chapters in the entire Bible as far as how much people debate about it. But you can kind of tell from the graphic up there that we're going to be looking at this and talking about honoring others, but that sounded like a pretty good title, and put that on the bulletin. The other option I had was a little bit different. The other option was hair and head coverings, men as the head of the wife getting drunk at communion sermon. That was the other one that I thought about, because that's all in here, you know. We're going to talk about long hair and head coverings for women, men being the head of the wife and getting drunk at communion. That's all in this chapter. And honestly, there's probably more in this chapter than we really have time to cover, and that's okay. But we're going to look at some important things. We're going to look at a couple of important things. But I can't help it. This is the chapter where it says that having long hair is a disgrace to a man, and I'll never forget that, because when I was in college, I was driving through Texas. I don't remember what in the world I was doing, but I was kind of on my own, and I was driving through Texas, and my grandfather on my dad's side lived in Texas. He lived in Wichita Falls, and I stopped there, and I was going to say hi to him. I had never actually spent time at my grandfather's house when it was just me. It had always been with the family. So then we had spent time with him, and he was one of my favorite relatives. I thought the world of him. I thought he was great. He was related to Laura Ingalls Wilder. That was cool. He could tell stories about that, and he had a really neat tractor. I mean, I just liked him, and so I wanted to stop by and see him, and I didn't realize. I knew he went to a particular church. I'd grown up in the same churches, and I knew they were kind of strict. But my grandfather had always been a really happy guy. And when I got back, my parents, I told my parents I stopped by to see him, and they had an interesting reaction. They said, "Really? How did that go?" You know, and it was just you could tell by the tone of their voice. And they were right, because when I had stopped there, it seemed a little bit, I don't know, tense. And really the problem was I had a mullet. I had a mullet back then, you know, I really did. If you see my wedding pictures, there's Brian with the mullet, you know, and I didn't curl it or anything. I didn't get the perm that all the guys did back then. I don't know if you guys know this, but in the 80s, you didn't just get a mullet, you got it permed, you know, and that was the only part of your hair that you had permed. So it'd be normal everywhere else and very curly back here. I hadn't done that. Mine was fairly straight. It came almost down to the shoulders, you know, but it was fairly straight, and it was a little bit tense in the house. I didn't know why, but he comes up to me and he says, "Do you know that the Bible says it's a shame for a man to have long hair?" And I was kind of taken aback by that, you know. You just see your grandparents, you think everybody's gonna be smiles and enjoying one another, but he was kind of upset with me because he didn't like my hair. And I had just some, you know, kind of lame response, trying to, well, you know, what constitutes long? I didn't know what to say, but that visit kind of ended, and it wasn't the most warmth thing, because my grandfather was really strict about such things. That's where I found out about that. And I'm sure he's up in heaven today, and probably very surprised at how many other people are up there with him. You know, he's probably surprised at that sort of thing. But some of you are thinking about that. But we Christians can be that way. We Christians can be that way sometimes. That's how we approach the Bible sometimes. We interpret the Bible in a particular way. We have our idea of this is what it means, and this is how we should follow it, and we demand that everybody else conform to it. Christians can be like that. It's one of the reasons why we have so many churches, and one of the reasons why we have so many debates and so many issues. And we worry, and we debate, and we battle, and we have tense moments over all those kinds of issues that center around our interpretations and how we think what we think it means. And it's why we have such great debates today about issues like the roles of women in church. That we hear that many churches and church groups and denominations are kind of going at war with each other, and especially when it comes to husbands and wives and men and women. And there are other issues as well. And in the middle of all of that, we have had But we haven't always looked good. There have been abuses of power in churches. There have been abuses of people and of children in churches. And whatever our doctrine is, we haven't always looked like that we've had it all figured out. We can tell people this is what the Bible says, but we haven't always followed it. And so as we approach this chapter, a controversial one, I want us to think about what Jesus said. It's in Matthew chapter 23, verse 23. Jesus said, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees." By the way, those were religious folks that he was talking to. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees." He calls them hypocrites. He says, "You pay a tenth of mint, dill, and cumin," and that's what they tithe. He's talking about them giving their tithe. So they paid that tenth, and that's what a tithe means. It means a tenth. And he says, you've done that. You've done the religious thing. You've paid your tithes, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. That kind of stuff was in the Old Testament too. That kind of stuff was in their Bible as well. And they had been really focused on the religious aspects, the little things, but they had missed the big stuff. They'd missed the things that God had said about justice and mercy and faithfulness. And Jesus says these things should have been done without neglecting the others. He didn't say that these other issues aren't important, that we need to just ignore those. He just said we have to make sure we're getting the big things right. Those have to be a focus. And he tells them, "Blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but gulp down a camel." So I guess Jesus has some humor. You guys are focused on something as small as a gnat. It's kind of like when you're at a board meeting and you spend an hour talking about how to spend $100 when your budget is in the thousands, you know. And I'm not picking on our church. I was in a church where the budget on a particular month, we would take in about $100,000. But let me tell you, we could spend an hour on $100 in a board meeting, because sometimes we get really focused on the little things or in the details, and we miss the most important. Jesus says, you're straining out a gnat, you're worried about the little stuff, you're focused on that, but you're gulping down a camel. The more important things are more important than the other things. I want you, if you could you say that with me? Just say, the more important things are more important than the other things. That's what Jesus was saying. And let me tell you, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, there are a lot of things. And there are a lot of things that we could talk about and get bogged down in. There are questions about long hair. There are questions about head coverings for women. There are questions about the roles of women and the roles of men and husbands and wives. There's questions about church worship and taking communion and how we do that and what we do, what's appropriate. And there are a lot of things like that in chapter 11. And there are more things for us to think about if we get down to it that we debate about. There are more things like we could talk about things that are important: church attendance, elders and deacons, the stuff that we believe, the doctrine that we hold, the plans that we have for the future, the ministries that we have going. We could talk about a lot of things. Anytime we want to get together, we could talk about a lot of things. But the most important things are still more important than the other things, like justice and mercy and faithfulness. And we don't need to ignore the little stuff, but we want to make sure we're doing the big things. And I think anytime that we have debates over what the Bible teaches, anytime that we run into issues or a difficult chapter like 1 Corinthians chapter 11, where there are different opinions and different interpretations, I think if we do anything at all, we need to make sure that when we read a chapter like this, we make sure we get the important things. We make sure we don't miss those. A friend of mine and I were on the way to see the Dallas Cowboys play one time. I mean, we were gluttons for punishment. We were going to go watch them. And we were driving from Mountain View, Missouri. Mountain View, Missouri is about 100 miles from Springfield. east of Springfield. So we were headed towards Springfield, going to drive through, head down to Tulsa, Oklahoma City, go south somewhere, and we were gonna go to watch a game. He and I were going together, and we had everything. We had hit Rogersville. We had stopped. We were gonna hit the McDonald's for breakfast, and we were heading the rest of the way. And we had all of our money. We had our snacks. We had our jerseys. We had everything but the tickets. And along about the time we're in Rogersville, we realized we don't have the tickets. And let me tell you, you can get another jersey at the stadium. You can buy some more snacks along the way. If you need money, there's probably an ATM that you can stop at. But if you don't have the tickets, you're not going to the game. And so we had to stop. We had to stop, and we had to make some phone calls, and we got his dad to pick up the tickets, and we met him a little bit, and then we took off the rest of the way, and we got there. We still had time. But you have to get the most important things, because if we don't get the most important things, then all the other little doctrines that we have are not going to help. That's what happens in Revelation chapter 2. We read about it in Men's Life Group last week. There's a particular church in there that Jesus is talking to, and Jesus had complimented them. He said, "You're doing really well. You've worked really hard. You've been tireless." But he says, you've got one problem. He says in Revelation chapter 2, verse 4, he says, "But I have this against you. You've abandoned the love you had at first." And love's one of those most important things. Love's one of those things that's just critical. You've got to have that sort of thing. And Jesus told them, if you don't fix this, if you don't repent and fix this, you're not going to have a church anymore. We've got to get the big things right, because the more important things, they're more important than all the other things. So what can we see in the Bible? What can we see in 1 Corinthians 11? In a controversial chapter like this, that's the most important thing. And I think it starts by recognizing that we, here in this chapter, the big important thing is that people honor and respect not only God, but also each other. Because all of the things that this chapter talks about, they boil down to that. They boil down to honoring each other within their culture, within their circumstances, within the things that they were dealing with, to honor God and to honor each other. And I want to just talk about a couple of things that we can see. Not everything, because we don't have time. There's too many debates. There's too many details. But if we could just look at a couple of really important things, I think we can make sure that we honor God and we honor each other. And I think it starts with this, that we are faithful. Go the wrong way. I guess I've just got an extra slide in there. Hey, let's enjoy that extra slide, and now we'll move on. Okay. We need to be faithful. We need to be faithful. Now, that sounds like a churchy word, because we talk about faith all the time. And when you put your faith in Jesus, that means you're putting your trust in Him. But this is not really a churchy word when you put the full on the end of it. When you're talking about being faithful, we all understand that. That means to be committed. If you're faithful to your spouse, that means you're committed to your spouse, not to anybody else, but just to her or just to him. You're faithful to your spouse. If you go to the Yellowstone Park in Wyoming, there's a geyser there called Old Faithful. And Old Faithful is called Old Faithful because at the same amount of time, about the same time between each eruption, it erupts again. And you can count on it. They'll put a big clock there, next eruption expected. And here's the time when they expect it. And people can gather to watch it. And they can do that because Old Faithful is faithful. It's going to go off about the same time. It's going to be there. It's going to be something that you can depend on. And we can be faithful. We can be faithful when we love others. We can be faithful when we love God. We can be the person. We can be the dad, the mom, the husband, the wife that God wants us to be. We can think about that. We can be committed. We can be faithful. I think when we have looked at this, we have focused on the details and forgotten the most important things. And one of the most important things in this chapter is be faithful. We made it too complicated. There's a verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 3. And it says this in that chapter. Paul writes, "But I want you to know that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of the woman, and God is the head of Christ." And he goes on to talk about head coverings for women and wives. And he talks about how they should wear those when they're praying or prophesying. And we don't know all the details about head coverings and how they worked in that culture. We don't know, but you can read and you can tell that it has a lot to do with what they think is proper in their culture. In fact, a little bit later, he asks a question. He says, is it proper for a woman to pray with her head uncovered? Well, in our day, sure. But apparently in their culture, there was something that was improper about not doing that sort of thing. It was talking about propriety. And when you talk about propriety, you're talking about how society looks at something. You're talking about how your culture looks at something. So when they started talking about head coverings, they were talking about how do you do what's proper in your society? How do you do that? How do you show respect? How do you give each other honor? And that might change from one culture to another. Our culture has different ways of expressing things like that. But the principle is still the same. That whatever we do to show honor and respect, we should do that sort of thing. And Paul goes on to say that, well, men shouldn't have head coverings. And here's what he said for why. He says a man should not cover his head because he is the image and glory of God. Just going to let that sink in. My wife's in the nursery. Oh, she's watching. Hi. I was thinking I could go home today and say, hey, honey, I'm the image and the glory of God. She'd laugh at me. I don't know. I think sometimes we have looked at those verses and we have elevated ourselves with pride. It says, so too, woman is the glory of man. You'll notice that. In the next verse, it says, he tries to explain why. He says, for man did not come from woman, but woman came from man. And then it says in verse 9, neither was man created for the sake of woman, but woman was created for the sake of man. When we look at that, we can look at those verses and we can elevate ourselves. We can talk about how men are supposed to be in charge. We can talk about how everything should have this hierarchy. And as you can imagine, these verses that I've just read have been used to say that very thing. Have been used to say that men should be in charge, that the man is the head, so he should have authority over the woman. And it even appeals back to Genesis. It goes to the beginning. It says that man did not come from woman, but woman came from man, because back in Genesis, God had taken a rib out of Adam and he had formed Eve. And so the woman came from man. That's what it's going back to. That's what it's referring to. And so we begin to draw lines. And we begin to draw these lines and to limit women in church and in society. And that's how these verses have been used. And that's how they've been interpreted by many. Some today still preach that women need to be under someone's control and someone's direction. They need to be under their father's control. And then after their father, they need to be under their husband's control. And they're treated in that way, even today. Throughout history, we've treated women as lesser. We've treated them with disrespect. In many places and times in this world, women have been treated as property. There's many places in this world today, right now, that women can't go to school, are not allowed. They had to fight for their right to vote. Even in the United States, they had to struggle to get the right to vote. And we're one of the last to get the right to vote. And in many places in the world, they still can't do that sort of thing. In Paul's day and in his culture, when you went to court, the testimony of women wasn't trusted. And throughout all of that, and maybe because of all of that, because we've treated women as lesser, because we've treated them as property, because we've disrespected them, there has followed abuse that they've had to deal with, neglect that they've had to deal with, and much, much worse. We have concentrated on drawing lines and ignored the important stuff, like justice and love and faithfulness. And I would like to say something a little radical. I don't think for one second that Paul, in this chapter, by saying the things that he said, is trying to draw lines. Is trying to say that women have to stay in this spot, and if they get out, you need to punish them. I don't think he's saying that. I don't think he's saying that at all. I want to read it carefully for just a second. And if we could, to just kind of think of these things from his perspective. So he said that man is the image and the glory of God. That goes back to Genesis. Because in Genesis it says that God created us in his image. And so what he said there is true. We've been created in the image of God. So if he wants to say that man is in the image and the glory of God, that's true. And there's also nothing you can do about that sort of thing. That's just what the Bible says. That says how God created us. You can't enforce that. That's just what it is. That's how it is. We've been created in the image of God. That's how it is. There's another one where it says, woman is the glory of man. And he says, because woman came from man. Well, in Genesis, that's how it happened. In Genesis, God took Adam's rib because he knew that Adam couldn't do life on his own. It wasn't good for him to be alone. He needed somebody to go through life with him. And God took a rib from Adam and formed it into Eve. That's what Genesis says. And so when Paul says the woman came from man, he's not saying anything that isn't already true from his perspective. This is just how it is. This is just how it is. We're created in the image of God. And woman came from man? Yes, that's how God created things. And I'm really glad God created women. That's awesome. I have a great wife, and I'm so grateful for that sort of thing. But what he said is not something that needs to be enforced. It's just how it is. Created in the image of God, and woman came from man. He says Christ is the head of every man. And that's generally true. If you're going to be a follower of Jesus, he's the head. And the word head has been interpreted and they argue about how should you understand the word head. Should you understand it as the authority? Or should you understand it as the source? Kind of like the headwaters of a river. Is it the source? And then others have said, well, maybe it just means preeminence. And so there's big debates over that. But either way, whichever one you choose, Christ is kind of above me. And if I'm going to be a follower of Christ, he's going to be above me. He's going to be my source. He's going to be my authority. He's going to be, I get it. He's above me in that way. I get it. But there's also, I don't have to enforce that. I don't have to make sure. That's just how it is when you're a follower of Jesus. So none of these three things are anything that needs to be enforced. That's just how it is from Paul's perspective. He's not saying these are the lines we need to follow. He's just talking about this is reality. He says God is the head of Christ. And when Jesus came to earth, Jesus said, I came to do the will of my Father. And we could look at those things and we could say, he's just talking about the way things are. He's just talking about reality. But then he said something else, and this one's going to get me in trouble. So I want to speak it very carefully if I could. He said God is the head of Christ, but then he said man is the head of the woman. And maybe he meant the husband is the head of the wife. It's the same word. You just translate it either man or husband or woman or wife, depending on the context. And everybody argues over the way it should be translated here. But we'll just say man is the head of the woman. That's what the Bible I've got in front of me says. And in Paul's day especially, in Roman and in Jewish culture especially, that was generally true. Men had all the authority. Men had all the advantages. Men had all the power. In his society, in his perspective, he wasn't saying anything that anybody didn't already know. He was just saying this is how it is. In all of those things, everything that he said, especially in his situation, that was just how it was. And these days, our specific circumstances aren't quite the same. But I do think it's true that even in our relationships and in our marriages and in our churches, men and women, generally speaking, are different. We aren't exactly the same. And it's not saying that we have to draw lines, but it's just saying it's true. We're not the same. We don't approach things the same necessarily. We're not always in the same situation socially or with each other. We complement each other. but we're not the same in every way. We both feel a responsibility for our family, but that comes out in different ways as we work in our home and we work with our family, and that's okay that we're different sometimes. That's just how things are. And in church, men and women can often gravitate toward different areas of ministry. And that's okay too. That's just how things are. But this week, I was watching as a lady by the name of Caitlin Clark broke the record for the most points scored by a single lady in college basketball. And she shot her last shot, the one that broke the record, she shot it from there. Do you see the three-point line? She's a long ways from the three-point line. She is, if she'd have been moved over a little bit, she'd have been standing on the logo. She breaks the record for the most points scored in women's NBA history. She breaks it from there. The chances of me making a shot from there are really low. I'm not sure if I would even get it there the first time. I mean, that's a long ways. And I know a lot of guys that can't shoot a ball that far. And let me tell you, at the end of the game, because, well, actually, I think they had taken a timeout, but after they had a moment to just celebrate that she had broken the all-time record for the most points scored by any woman in college basketball history. There's actually another one that she's about 80 points away from that they didn't keep records back then, but she's going to break that one too. But after they started celebrating it, her brother bounds up, literally, he bounds out of the stands onto the court, and he's taller than she is. And I mean, he comes up to her and he just clobbers her. I mean, he gives her not just a bear hug, he almost tackled her. And it was kind of funny because she saw him coming and she smiled and you saw her do this. And he gives her a big old hug. And in that moment, let me tell you, you can tell there's differences between her and her brother. He's a little bit bigger. She's a little bit smaller. They're not the same. She hugs her dad right after that, and her dad he's in shape, he's buff, and he's congratulating. And you can tell there's differences between the two. You can tell. And there's differences in position because her dad is dad, her brother is her brother. But let me tell you, if either one of those guys is playing a basketball game, they're not going to say, hey, the men need to do the shooting, or the men need to be in charge, or the men need to control what's going on this basketball court. Both those guys would do what any of us would do. If we were playing on the same team, we would feed her the ball. Because God has given her some gifts. Let her use them. We don't have to draw lines around people and try to control people. That's not what Paul was saying. He was just talking about the way things were. Okay, we're in different places sometimes. Things are different. In our relationship, we're gonna naturally kind of fill certain roles. But whatever those roles are, and sometimes there'll be exceptions. Most of the time, it's the guys who can shoot a basketball from a long ways away. But she's an exception. Caitlin can make it from a long ways away. Let people use their gifts. Yes, there's differences in the way things are, but let people use their gifts for the Lord. Let them serve God. We will complement each other, but we are different, but that's okay. We don't need to limit or restrict. We just need to take care of our end of things. In the Christian world, we focused and debated and we divided over how to draw lines around women, what they can do and not do. But it's more important that we are faithful with what God has given us. Men might worry sometimes about keeping women in line, but it would be better if men, guys, I'm talking to all of us now, it'd be better if guys like us just focused on taking care of our own stuff instead of trying to control everybody else's. It'd be better. We don't need our wife, or anyone else to recognize that we are the leader. We just need to start being that rock in our wife's life that she can lean on, or our family's life that they can lean on, that person that she can depend on, that person that our kids can depend on. Just start being what God has already made you and where He's already put you. Be that person that your wife can depend on. Be that person that your kids can depend on. Be that person who doesn't wait for anybody else to fix the relationship, but takes it upon ourselves to do better, to be the first one to look in the mirror. You want to be the leader? Be the first one to apologize. Be the one that never gives up, even if everybody else does, because that's what leaders do. Instead of trying to control everybody else and make sure they're in the right spot, let's just take care of our stuff and be the leader and the person that God has created us to be. See, when Paul talks about the head, that shouldn't remind us of our authority. It should remind us of our responsibility to step up, to be that person people can count on. Paul was saying here, this is how things are. But what are we going to do with that? How are we going to approach it? We can be faithful. We can be faithful in our marriages. We can be faithful in our church. We can be faithful in our relationships. And when somebody can make a three-pointer from 1,000 feet away, we can celebrate. And it doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman. So be faithful. And the other thing I wanted to point out here is that this chapter says, act justly. Act justly toward God and each other. That wasn't happening so much here in Corinth. They were taking communion, and it was a train wreck. Now, I've had a communion train wreck before. I don't know if you've had a communion train wreck, but I've had a communion train wreck before. I was at a church. I was a youth minister, first church I ever went to that I became a youth minister at, and we took communion, and somebody had left it out all night, or maybe for a couple of days. I don't know. All I know is when you took a drink of that juice, it was no longer just grape juice. In fact, it's, whew, okay, we're Catholic now. It was just, it was something. Well, these guys were having a worse time. It says in verse 20, it says, when you come together, it's not to eat the Lord's Supper. You guys are not taking the Lord's Supper here. He says, for at the meal, each one eats his own supper. You guys are coming and treating the Lord's Supper as if it's an actual meal. While another, he says, so one person is hungry while another gets drunk. So apparently they had a Catholic communion going there too. They had the real stuff. He says in verse 22, he says, don't you have homes in which to eat and drink, or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What should I say to you? Should I praise you? I do not praise you in this matter. They had been taking communion, and they had been, you could just see how he describes it. He says, you despise the church. That's how their behavior was coming across, that they despised the church, that they humiliated those who had nothing, because the food would come by, and instead of everyone sharing it, somebody would take it all. Somebody would take all the food and all the drink, and somebody else might not get anything. And we would look at that and we would say, that's not right, that's not fair. But that's what justice comes down to. It comes down to here's what's right and here's what's fair. And we all have a sense of those kinds of things. Saw a guy on Bennett Street, on my road. I was going down Bennett Street, and he slowed down because, and I know this because I lived there, they had ripped the concrete out and they had put asphalt over it, but apparently had run out of asphalt before they finished it. And so instead of being smooth, it's just barely there. And so it's extremely rough. It's hard on your tires. And I was going one way and the guy was coming the other way, and he slowed down for it. And I do that all the time. I slow down for that thing because it's hard on the tires. And the guy behind him just laid on the horn. And I thought, that's not right. Good grief. Just slow down, chill out. So I chased him for a while. No, I didn't. But I wanted to. I was imagining that in my head. I imagined, pulling him over and say, come on, didn't you see the spot in the road? That was unfair of you to just honk at that guy just because you're in a big hurry. I wanted to chase him, but I don't do that sort of thing anymore. And so I didn't. I have. But what they were doing in that church when they took communion, it wasn't right either. Paul tells them, he says, one of the reasons why you guys are struggling, one of the reasons why people in your church have passed away is because of how you're acting at communion. You're not acting right, you're acting unjustly. And that's where these two parts of Scripture come together. That's where all the talk that we've talked about men and women come together right here, because the church as a whole has preached about controlling and maintaining a hierarchy And yet our relationships have suffered. There's been abuse that has happened. There's been all kinds of scandalous stuff that's gone on. And we've treated women way too often as lesser, and we've treated them with disrespect. And in the past, throughout history, the church even has treated women as property. They haven't always been allowed to go to school. They did have to fight for the right to vote. They have faced abuse. They have faced neglect. They have faced worse. And we weren't being fair. We weren't being just. We were taking all the power and authority for ourselves. We missed what was really important. But the more important things are more important than all the other things. Love and faithfulness and justice. However we navigate issues like this, let's get the important things right. We don't have hair coverings. Our hairstyles are different. We can find different ways to honor and respect each other, honor and respect our spouses, our friends, our neighbors. But it starts by trying to be the person that God wanted us to be in the first place and to focus on the important things. Jesus cares about those things. And He cares about you. And the fact that He cares about justice, the fact that He cares about mercy, the fact that He cares about love tells you that He cares about people just in general. That's why He died for you and me. It's why He asked us to put our faith in Him. And He's not confronting us today about our hairstyle, but He is inviting us to come and follow Him and to be the person that He's called us to be.